Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Duffington Talks. And oh boy, have we had, a week. We've had a week. As I said, this is going to be every Monday, and I've picked the wrong day to do it because tomorrow, according to Trump, may be a very exciting day for American politics, as Trump has said that tomorrow he's going to get arrested. So we will be talking about that on today's show, and we will also be talking about the arrest warrant for Putin and an important conversation I want to have about that regarding war crimes and the Ukraine war in general, just to sort of contextualize that, but also to have a discussion on a certain issue that I feel really isn't being talked about enough, and so I really want to bring that to your attention and talk you guys through it, and leapfrog off of what's been said about Putin and Russian war crimes. So to start off with Putin, we have to start off with rather bizarrely, starting off with whether there is actually a war in Ukraine. And what we mean by that is that a lot of the time we say war when we don't mean war. And that's important because war has to have some kind of declaration. A lot of the time that we call things, X war, I think Afghanistan is the Afghan war. I don't actually think it's a war, it's a conflict because no one's declared war. It's just a military operation. So because there's no two states fighting, it's not a war. And so there are the crimes that occur in a war are different to the war crimes that occur during a war can be treated differently in terms of who you can arrest, who you can put in prison, and that's important for what we're going to discuss coming up after we talk about Putin and Russia. So yes, this is actually a war. Putin didn't declare war. He claimed to commence a special military operation, which was met by the Ukrainian government as a formal declaration of war. And so, therefore, the Ukrainians didn't declare war. They have acted like the Russians have declared war. The Russians didn't technically declare war, but everyone's in a state of war. I mean, it's often called it says here it's called the on Wikipedia. I think they call it the Russo-Ukrainian War, often commonly called the war in Ukraine. So we have a war, and that's important for what we're going to get into. So we'll start straight away with Russia, and I think it's important to start with Russia um, before I want to get into the sort of harder hitting stuff. And what I want to talk about is the reverse side of things, the things that aren't really being talked about, but I think really do need to be talked about, and that's um, war crimes committed by Ukraine and the sort of side effect. Not side effects is the wrong word, but you know the consequences of saying that Putin should be arrested for committing war crimes, and then what needs to be followed up if this is the case, if this is the attitude that people want to take, how we need to then start treating um, what's going on, what's being done by Ukrainians, and yes, that should be in conversation. It should really be in the discourse, but at the moment, at this current present moment in time, Google Ukrainian war crimes. You won't get anything. You may get, I think, one article from Amnesty International, but you won't, and you'll get a load of sort of the formal stuff from the sort of the UN and the International Crime Court, but you won't get any articles. You won't get any journalism on it, and this is what I aim to do. But we have to put it in context. We have to talk about Russia first, and we'll just start with what actually happened. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has basically said that they've issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin for committing war crimes. What they focus on is the unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia since Moscow's invasion in 2022. This is a quote from a BBC article. Just to briefly summarise it, but essentially, uh, this is tantamount to the fact that Russia has committed war crimes. I think we can safely say now that Russia have committed war crimes. There's clearly enough evidence. These things. There's a lot of investigations from the OHCHR, which is the United Nations sort of human rights, the Office of the High Commissioner. So they've been involved in a lot of the investigations in the war, and so they've put a lot of evidence over. Also, Amnesty International have been involved in a lot of the evidence. There's probably many more sources that I'm unaware of that have been involved in gathering evidence, as well as a lot of the footage provided by Ukrainians themselves, and the testimony provided by Ukrainians to European news about the sort of horrors conducted by Russian soldiers. But what they're trying to get Russia on is something they can sort of definitively prove at the moment, is that Russians are illegally moving people around, specifically children, and the Russians denied it. But of course, they're not going to say that. Yep, we've been doing that, obviously. So it comes in that context, and there's a list of war crimes, and this is just to sort of go through the war crimes that Russia have committed, and I think a lot of these would be not confirmed war crimes. Obviously, there's video footage of everything, but reported war crimes because no charges have been made against them. So, but we can quite safely say that the Russians are guilty of these war crimes, despite the fact that no court has made a verdict on any of them. So we have indiscriminate attacks and attacks against civilian targets, shelling of certain areas, and alongside that, use of cluster munitions and cluster bombs, which have been banned since 2008, I believe. Yep, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but neither Russia or Ukraine ratified that, so they don't agree that they should be banned. Cluster munitions, I think, they just set off a load of debris, essentially. It just releases a bomb, and then a bomb releases more bombs, and so they're very deadly. And if you're dropping them in civilian targets, they're going to cause mass effect, causing many casualties. And again, if you're bombing civilians for a start, that's a crime. And targeting certain areas, cultural properties, hospitals and medical care facilities, energy infrastructure, civilian targets in general are not allowed to be attacked, because that's a war crime in itself. Not too sure if all of my listeners will know, but for example, with the dam busters in World War II that targeted the German dams, that would be constituted as a war crime by today's standards, because it's a civilian target, and you're effectively hurting more civilians than you are soldiers. So that's the sort of on the bombing side of things. You've also got murder of civilians, ill treatment, torture, mass killing, sexual assault, rapes, horrible. The acts of the soldiers, absolutely horrible. Some of the testimony, abduction as well, and the list goes on and on at where these were happening. But absolutely horrible actions from the Russian soldiers in terms of how they've treated the civilian population of occupied territories. And then when they're in gunfights, they've been accused, the Human Rights Watch accused them of endangering civilians in placements of military objectives and using them as human shields. Again, a lot of these are accusatory, but with all of the sort of footage adding up, I think that we can take a stance and sort of more safely say that I know a lot of it is accusatory, but we shouldn't we shouldn't dismiss it just because that the court hasn't said anything about this stuff. I think the main reason why the court hasn't said anything about this stuff is because they're charging soldiers individually. So they've put Putin on sort of state-based things, and then the soldiers will get charged. I think we've charged. I know that 2 soldiers were charged sort of definitively for crimes, but yeah, they'll get soldiers individually where they can for that, and they'll just blame the state for sort of state-based things. So deportation is a state-based thing. A lot of these war crimes, if they weren't, given the order to do that by higher up, and it's just soldiers doing that, doing that themselves, you can't charge the state for that sort of thing. So that's why Putin hasn't been charged for it. But I think we can certainly say that war crimes have been committed by the Russians, and a vast amount of war crimes have been committed by the Russians. So we flip it over now, and we have outlined that the Russians have clearly committed war crimes. Like the Russians as a state, Russian soldiers, Russian military actions, war crimes here, there, and everywhere, and it is abysmal. Like, I mean, war is horrible, full stop. But the way that Russia have conducted the war is incredibly problematic, and it is horrible to see war in the 21st century in any part of the world. Like, just, I mean, we think about cluster bombs. There's a lot of scrutiny on Russia using cluster bombs. And you've got to think about the conflict in Yemen. I know Yemen is a certain area where cluster bombs have been deployed indiscriminately, and I think that, I mean, it's another issue for another day. But the way that the media covers the Ukrainian war, and it's the way that it's not covered other wars, the certain perspective of criticism of certain munitions used, and I mean, people will find the Yemeni civil war has been going on for a long time, so I'm sure that there is coverage of the certain munitions used and criticism of it, but it's just the way that it's it's framed by the mainstream news. I've not looked in a long time, but I've not seen that sort of the same hard-hitting anti-war lines that I have for other conflicts that we will see in the Ukraine war, and I think that that's disappointing in itself. But I think that it sort of sets up this, I don't want to say biased narrative, because I think that everyone, with their head screwed on, can quite clearly say that Russia are the aggressors and they're wrong. They should never invade another territory. So don't think it's better bias, unfair bias, but what it does do is it's bias in when you start admitting things. And so interestingly, an article from Amnesty International actually criticised Ukrainian fighting tactics for endangering civilians. So as we saw, Russians have been supposedly indiscriminately attacking civilians, and they've been committing war crimes. And the Amnesty report found that whilst Russia have been committing indiscriminate attacks which have injured civilians, not every attack on civilian areas were indiscriminate. And that's an interesting thing, because the sort of attacks on civilian areas, and most namely missile strikes, they're the ones that hit the news, and they're the ones where you see all the pictures on the news. They're the sensationalized photos. And Amnesty discovered that Ukrainian military bases, were set up in residential areas, including schools and hospitals. So this is where we have our first, problematic other side of the story. Now, this does not mitigate what the Russians have done, but it does need to be talked about. So, in war, understandably, the Ukrainians are in a defensive war, but civilian targets are out of the picture, and that's for both sides. I mean, ideally, you'd fight somewhere else. Again, we don't live in an ideal world, and the Ukrainians, again, just to sort of give nuance even more, the Ukrainians are fighting in large urban areas. I think a lot of this is from the documentation that the Amnesty collected was from Kharkiv, for example. So we're not saying here, got to look at it in perspective of that the Ukrainians are defending for their lives. So they're not thinking it's not some kind of cool calculating decision from the Ukrainians, but just got to bring it to the attention and then put it in its own context. The Ukrainians are committing minor war crimes. They're putting civilians at risk. Well, in this case, a minor war crime, but they're not doing it cruelly and calculatingly. They're doing it, as a matter of survival, but still a war crime nonetheless. So we move on to the sort of they have testimony from Ukrainians who, for example, were saying that there were strikes in civilian areas, and they've got survivors and witnesses saying, "Oh yeah, there were Ukrainian soldiers next door, and then the Russians bombed the area and they hit civilian targets." And so Amnesty are sort of saying that, well, in this case, in some of these cases, it's not just a direct strike on civilian targets, but it is trying to find Ukrainian soldiers within civilian areas, and the bombs are not effective. And then coupled alongside that, when the Russians use cluster bombs, even if they're hitting a military target, cluster bombs absolutely deadly. Shrapnel flies everywhere, hitting civilian targets, and you've got, think about urban density. You bomb one target, you end up bombing 4 or 5 around it, and this is why civilians are at risk from just the nature of the war, I guess would be the sort of conclusion to that. So in the Amnesty report, for example, Amnesty researchers claim that they witnessed Ukrainian forces using hospitals as military bases in 5 locations, and in one of these locations, on the 28th of April 2022, Russia actually launched an airstrike at a medical laboratory in Kharkiv, and the Ukrainian forces had indeed set up a base in that compound. And so that's a violation of international humanitarian law. Ukraine has set up bases in schools that were temporarily shut down. Just, again, they're in a school, but I don't think anyone is going to school. So 22 of 29 schools. Again, I think this is in the Donbass region. I don't think they say specifically where, but 22 out of 29 schools visited by Amnesty found evidence that either soldiers were there or soldiers were there currently. So then when the Russian forces are striking schools, they're bombarding schools because Ukrainian soldiers are using them according to their military intelligence. So this is the sort of context that we're facing, and Ukraine is one of the 114 countries that have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration, protecting education amid armed conflict, and this actually allows parties to make use of abandoned or evacuated schools where there is no viable alternative. So it's a tough one because obviously the Ukrainians are going to argue that there's no viable alternative. You are technically allowed to use schools in war. However, Amnesty does say in sort of summary of this that militaries have an obligation to avoid using schools that are near houses or apartment buildings full of civilians, because this puts their life at risk unless there is compelling military need. And also, if they do use schools, they should warn civilians and evacuate them, which didn't happen in the cases scrutinised by Amnesty. So again, just to build the picture here, the Ukrainians are, I guess, tantamount to committing a minor misdemeanor in terms of the law. They're breaking the law, but it's more of a slap on the wrist, kind of thing. And so that is why some, not all, and probably not many, but some Russian attacks on seemingly civilian areas are technically military strikes because the Ukrainians are using them. And again, the second we get news of a certain strike on a certain civilian area and it hits the news, not one thought, there's not one side of things that's saying, maybe this was a genuine military target, because the news builds a narrative, and I'm not saying that every single one was a genuine military target. Amnesty aren't saying that, but what it does build the picture of is it creates the sort of not a counter story, but it creates the true picture that, there's not one clear attacking civilians and attacking soldiers. It gets intermixed. I mean, we have this real nitty gritty urban war, and there are civilian casualties. And if we want to pick a phrase that sort of highlights this, I guess, sadly, and again, not calculated, but a lot of these civilians, in the cases of being bombed, are collateral damage. And collateral damage, it's such a horrible phrase, because it really seems like you're justifying the actions of dropping bombs on civilian areas. We're not. What we're saying is that in war, both sides are maneuvering around areas that are populated by people, and they are navigating this space. And in navigating this space, when they're fighting, certain weapons are used, bombs, and problematic cluster bombs are used to attack the soldiers, and in doing so, they also catch civilians, which is wrong, and this is why war shouldn't happen in the first place. And I mean, the pretty easy stance, to get ourselves out of this is, well, don't fight. And it's not easy to say that in this case, because I'm sure plenty of people don't want the war to happen, but that doesn't stop the war. That doesn't make any large grand sort of statement on stopping the war, but it does help our conscience, I guess, standing against war. But in reality, you can't just stop a war by saying let's stop the war. So this is why bringing this to our attention, just keeping up with the facts, however hard it is, and not overly criticizing Ukrainian military tactics in this case. Just to summarize that, I would say certainly that we can't be overcritical of Ukraine in this situation. In the case of using civilian points to operate, because they are fights. It's the nature of the war, and it's horrible. But they're the defense. Amnesty put it out in big writing that just because they're the defensive side, being in a defensive position does not exempt the Ukrainian military from respecting international humanitarian law. And that's important, because I think it's just important, that importantly needs to be said. Amnesty have said it. I've not found any other news site that have said it. If someone has, please alert me to it. But Amnesty is not a news site. This is Amnesty News, but Amnesty is an organisation. So I've not seen any news saying it. And I think that because people don't like nuance in the modern world, they don't like the fuzzy grey area, it's quite hard for people to say, well, being critical of Ukrainian military tactics doesn't mean we're being critical of Ukraine. And as I've said, I think it's a misdemeanor, it's a slap on the wrist, and it's, if the Ukrainians come out at the end of the war, someone can sit down and say, this is what you did, this was wrong, but that doesn't mean that we should be rounding up all the Ukrainian military officials and putting them in prison because they've broken the law. But we should just say, look, this is what the Ukrainians are doing, this is why sometimes the Russians do that, because it puts things in context, and context is critically important and critically missed by the news. So we have this nitty-gritty context of civilian strikes, and I think that's been dealt with in fair case, and we've reached a nice summary on that. So next we have to turn to Russian prisoners of war, and this is slightly more. This requires slightly more nuance. So again, to start off with treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war, we have torture, ill treatment, beatings, threats, mock execution, and electrical and positional torture. I don't actually know what positional torture is, but it's stress position, submission position. Places the human body in such a way that great amount of weight is placed upon just one or two muscles to torture them. So, and this is to the Ukrainian prisoners. Female prisoners were threatened with sexual violence and subject to degrading treatments and enforced nudity. So, Ukrainians, again, these are war crimes. These are horrible. Anyone guilty of this, found guilty of this, should definitely be put in prison. I don't think these are non-excusable. And we go over to the other side, and this is the hardest hitting part of war crimes, because with the first case, obviously you can put it in the context of when you're in the middle of battle, you can't expect the Ukrainians to consider everything other than the fact that they're defending their country. So that side of things, the first part of this analysis is very excusable. This, however, is not in the heat of battle and is purely taking frustration out. And so we'll look at Russian prisoners of war. And, this is from the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. And some of this is discovered from, evidence, and some of this is supposed. So 50 cases of torture. So this is from Ukrainians towards Russians. 50 cases of torture, ill treatment of prisoners of war, beatings, shootings, stabbing, positional and electric torture. One prisoner of war was reportedly suffocated by a Ukrainian policeman during interrogation. So we have, we also have, there was one that I think hit the news, was an alleged execution of a captured Russian soldier, which is under investigation. We have a disputed situation where Russians supposedly surrendered and were shot at, or mock surrendering, that is under investigation. We don't know if that was an execution and a fight back, or I don't really. Some of these sometimes they just don't really know what's going on. It's very hard to go through objectively when everything is coming out of subjective sides of things. Torture. There are videos of Ukrainians torturing Russian soldiers. Russian armed forces shooting kneecaps of Russian soldiers. And so this is completely different from what we've just seen. And again, the Russians very guilty of this, but so are the Ukrainians. And in both cases here, anyone guilty of committing these sorts of torture, prisoners of war crimes towards prisoners of war, should be arrested. And the reason why is because there's no excuse. And this is not a justification. It's the mentality of things from the Ukrainians is that the Russians are, when the Russians come in and they start rounding up prisoners of war and killing civilians and committing sexual assaults against civilians, the reason why they're doing that is to instill fear. And because when you instill fear, people are less likely to rebel against you, and especially if you're in hostile territory, you want to subdue the population. So again, there is a reason behind that. It's horrible, but there is a reason. That's 90% of the reason. Obviously, 10% of the reason will be they want to let out their frustrations. Again, a horrible reason. But you need to sort of talk about why things happen, because things happen for a reason. So that's the reason for the Russians doing it. They're instilling fear, which is wrong. They're taking out their frustration, which is wrong. The Ukrainians also taking out their frustration. If you've just been fighting a battle to defend your village, your town, you've captured Russians, you're going to take out your frustrations on them, which is wrong. And again, we're talking about things that in the heat of battle, people don't always make the right decisions. And I cannot believe to say probably how incredibly hard it is for soldiers to be able to switch on and switch off. And in fact, I don't think it's possible for a lot of these soldiers to switch on and switch off. Hence, what happens when people come home, PTSD, increased in violence, that sort of high alert, being in a state of high alert, because the human body isn't built just to switch on and switch off. And so it's understandable, but that doesn't make it right. And so Ukrainians torturing these people and committing these war crimes, I mean, they have to be, upon investigation, if found guilty, they have to be imprisoned. Because I don't think that, you can't describe this one away as misdemeanors, and you can't really put this in any nuanced context that really makes it okay. Because it is wrong, and there's plenty of documentation of the Russians doing it. I mean, we know that the Russians are doing it. I don't want to go into all the detail of what the Russians are doing, because there is loads that the Russians have been doing to Ukrainian prisoners of war. But that's not the purpose of this segment, because we know that the Russians are committing all these war crimes. We know there's vast news coverage of Russian war crimes. There's so much more news coverage of Russian war crimes. However, we need to start talking about what the Ukrainians are doing, and the reason why is because it makes the discourse. You can't talk about one side of a story and not talk about another side and say you're reporting on the story, because you're not. You're just creating a narrative, and then people will go away reading that, thinking, oh yeah, this is what the Russians are doing, and the Ukrainians are just doing nothing. But it's not entirely true, and so it's important to bring this up. And so we have this situation where it is much more unjustifiable, because when you take prisoners, you should ill treatment, torture. Both sides completely guilty. Both sides should be treated exactly the same in this case, because there is no justification, and so therefore, when you charge one, you charge the other in equal amount for committing that type of war crimes, because it's just unforgivable from both sides. And the last thing I wanted to draw to people's attention, and again, it's slightly important because I know that there are a fair number of people from European countries that have gone to fight for Ukraine, and so obviously it's a war. Britain and any NATO force cannot deploy troops, because that would be considered as joining the war, and that would start World War III, in essence, because then Russia would technically be at war with NATO, which is not something that anyone wants to happen. So what happens is that people, individuals from nations go and they fight. So there are British nationals there, Moroccan nationals fighting for Ukraine. I'm sure there are Americans, and I'm sure there are plenty of other nations. It's just seen reading off the top of my head. And so the Ukrainians are being given support from other countries. Now, there are also, and I don't know how reported this is in terms of the Russians, because I think that a lot of the news very much makes it seem like it's Ukraine versus Russia quite rigidly. However, there are certain prominent enough groups of Ukrainians that are pro-Russian, and they actually are fighting for Russia. And now, in a war, and actually in an armed conflict, so the start about what the difference between a conflict and a war and that being important. Okay, that's not too important for the difference here. I thought it would be, but it's not. Actually, in any international armed conflict, you can't prosecute combatants for participation. And so that is to say that when you are fighting against someone else, you can't, if you take a prisoner of war, you can't just arrest them for fighting, because it's it's against international humanitarian law, and I'd assume in doing so, because these are states have armies don't sign up deliberately to go out fighting people. It's a profession. You can't just arrest people for doing their job. And so in this case, there are armed groups fighting. There are pro-Russian armed groups specifically made up of Ukrainian nationals, and this is where it gets important for another and a state-based war crime that, as of the publication of the this human rights article, which is, I think, undated. No, 15th of November 2022. So as of the 15th of November 2022, and the publication of this article, we have Russian, pro-Russian Ukrainians being prosecuted by the Ukrainian state for fighting in the war, which is a war crime. It's a crime against international humanitarian law, and this is a big thing that I want to talk about, because it's I understand why the Ukrainians would do it, because a Ukrainian fighting against your state, you're going to see them as a traitor. But this is another thing that, well, in this case, I don't think that we should punish everyone, but if the war ends, if the war is reasonably concluded with the Ukrainians successfully defending themselves, that anyone arrested by the Ukrainians for fighting in the conflict should be released, and that's without a question. We shouldn't be going in there. I think Amnesty. There's another thing that Amnesty were critical of, arresting people, because there are Ukrainians that will be pro-Russian, and there are people in the Donbass that are pro-Russian. There are people, I mean, I don't know how prominent it is, but there's clearly enough that there is clearly continuous from the start. So from the start of the war to November, there have been prosecution of members of Russian-affiliated armed groups. So there's clearly enough to have numerous prosecutions of combatants, and this is a big thing for me, because it is unjustified arrest, and unjustified arrest is wrong, and understand the frustration from the Ukrainians that want to arrest these people, and they want them in prison, but you can't do that, and you have to begrudgingly accept that people are going to disagree with your state, and you can't arrest people. You can't just be authoritarian and say, well, you're either with us or you end up in prison. They're prisoners of war. It's a war. War has disagreements. I'm sure that we don't need to say with any doubt that the Russians and the Ukrainians disagree with each other, but that doesn't excuse arresting people, imprisoning them, trialing them, and imprisoning them for fighting in war. That should never happen, because you can disagree with it all you like, but these people are still protected by international law. And so that's one thing that, obviously, I think that I hope that the United Nations keeps the development up of that, because that's another thing that I hadn't read anywhere until I started doing digging on war crimes on both sides. And I've seen no mention of that by the news, because the news make it seem like there are no Ukrainian nationals helping Russia. And I've seen a lot of segments by the sort of when they bring in the military experts, especially at the start of the war, and it was like, well, the Russians thought people in the Donbass would turn over, but no, they met staunch Ukrainian resistance. One that might be true, but these segments were just devoid of nuance, because they created the picture. I mean, even for me, who was trying to do reading of it, and there was nothing substantial at the time, but now we have substantial information that there are armed groups, there are Ukrainian armed groups fighting against the state of Ukraine, and they're being arrested, and they're being put in prison, and that's against international law. Something that should definitely be kept tabs on. Hopefully, that Ukraine come out the other side of the war successfully, but in hoping that happens, in that scenario, they should release all of these prisoners, and we, as neutral states, I guess technically neutral states in the war, should hold Ukraine to do that. And this is why we need to keep these things in the discourse, because if they slip between the cracks and we start focusing on what Russia are doing, Ukraine get away with committing war crimes. And you have to be fair and respect all humans involved, because how many people, how many Russian soldiers are there with exactly the same ideology as Putin fighting in the war? You know, it's not right and justified to we have a figure such as Putin that we can sort of pin these crimes on, and we have Russian soldiers that are committing war crimes, and we have Ukrainians that are committing war crimes, but you don't group and indiscriminately judge people, and so that's something that we need to keep in the discourse. We need to keep this in our mind, and we need to keep talking about it. Hopefully, now making this segment, people are keeping aware of it, and I'm not saying that the Ukrainian state is bang out of order and we should start after the war coming to arrest them all, because a lot of the stuff is in justified defense, especially the civilian things, and it's not state based to the extent that Russia is, where the probably, again, this is hearsay from myself, but I can imagine that with what the Russians have done in occupied territories, I can imagine the Russian commanders trying to, telling their soldiers to create that state of fear, and that being a tactic in occupation. I'm not a military expert by any means. I know some things about military history, but nowhere near the extent to which some people do. So this is just my opinion on the matter, but I could certainly imagine seeing that as state-based shock and horror tactics. I don't think that the Russians and the Ukrainians can be treated the same way from the state position. I feel like criminals, people that commit war crimes towards prisoners of war can be treated equally, because I believe that they are inherently equal cases of just overextended brutality in any case. So I think that they can be treated equally. And again, the Ukrainian state, you should never be prosecuting the Ukrainian state for arresting members, Ukrainian nationals that were pro-Russian, but they should be released. So, to provide a summary, there is no way that you can, after all this analysis, you can't go away saying, oh, well, yeah, Ukraine's just as bad as Russia in committing war crimes. It's not. Objectively, it's not. But it is committing war crimes. Minor war crimes, but war crimes nonetheless. And it's just, it's just something that needs to be talked about. If you want to have a discourse on Putin and war crimes, you have to talk about this. And the reason why you have to talk about it is because it's fact. It has happened. The United Nations human rights, these are reports that have been ratified and are continually being updated, and obviously news gets updated and changed all the time, but that doesn't excuse certainly British media from not talking about it, because that's wrong. So just to bring it to everyone's attention, the Ukrainians are committing war crimes, minor war crimes in most cases, war crimes that should not be prosecuted from a state level, but certainly treatment of prisoners of war is a concern, because if the war goes on, that'll only get worse. And that's my major concern, obviously, for human life. Don't want the war to happen in the first place, but the worse, the more this war drags on, I think the worse we'll see treatment for prisoners of war on both sides. Particularly for the Ukrainians, who won't want to keep housing numbers of Russian soldiers. If their fighting gets more and more desperate, this is just hypothetically, if it gets more and more desperate, they're going to start taking more and more desperate measures, because they don't want to take more and more Russians. Hence why they're putting the Russian affiliated soldiers in prison, because they don't want them to be prisoners of war. They're easier in prison. They don't have to give them certain treatment. And again, they're fighting a defensive war. They're fighting for their lives. It's understandable why they're doing this. I'm not saying, we get the torches out after, if they win the war and we start a witch hunt. Just keep it in mind. And so on that note, we move on to the second story. And a story that I want to introduce because next week this will probably be returned to, and I mean if what Trump has said is right, definitely be returned to. Is that Trump said on his Truth social platform on Saturday that he was going to be arrested on Tuesday and wants his supporters to protest. Now, I've done quite a lot of reading on this, and so we've sort of got a lot of different opinions on this, but we can start with what he's actually being arrested for. Now, Trump paid off Stormy Daniels. He had an affair with Stormy Daniels, and she's a porn star, and so they had an affair. Trump paid her off to not say anything about it. Now, Trump used campaign funds to do this, or he used money from the campaign to do this, essentially, over the silence. And now there are two things that I've seen wrong with this. So Trump committed a misdemeanor. However, he also committed fraud because he didn't say, obviously didn't say that when he paid his lawyer, who he paid the lawyer to do it, and he said that it was for it was for campaign purposes. So he's committed fraud, and the reason why this misdemeanor turns into a crime is because it's two crimes. And so it's a crime in the service of fraud. It doubles up, and so it turns this minor misdemeanor of using campaign funds, but also committing fraud to do it. It's two crimes in one. So hence why Trump can be arrested for it. Not too much is being said about the case specifically, because obviously it's an ongoing case, but that's basically what I get the gist of it. It's that it's essentially they committed fraud to do this, and so Trump has supposedly got a leak that he's being arrested. And interestingly, that Trump came out and said this himself, and so there are two things that two possible ways I think we can go with this. Now, either Trump is trying to scare them off by inciting his fan base to react, which is one very possible opportunity. He's saying, "Oh, look at the support I have. Don't arrest me." So he's not actually going to be arrested, but he thinks he's going to be arrested, or he is actually going to be arrested tomorrow, and he is alerting his fan base. So he's either trying to scare them off, or I don't see it any other way. I think his back is either against the war, or he's trying. In either case, his back is against the war. He's either coming out fighting, or being pushed against the war, and telling everyone that he's been pushed against the wall. To continue this analogy that seems to have killed itself. So the issue is, I mean, for the broader sort of political spectrum, is that if he is arrested, he'll obviously get out on bail, and then it will go to trial. He can't run for office if you're a criminal. And he's obviously campaigning for the presidential election in 2024, but he can run standing trial because he's not guilty of any crimes. So we're in a situation where, obviously, it depends on whether Trump is found guilty before the election, whether it affects his chances in the election is not clear. However, if he is elected, he can't pardon himself of criminal charges. So I don't entirely know, and I'm sure not many people know, what happens if he becomes president and is then arrested. Now, I'm assuming that then the vice president would become president, but I don't know if that would only be an acting capacity if he comes back to being president after he's arrested. This is you can see how confusing this situation is. So Trump is running for office. Trump is trying to be president, and that's it. This is all even if he wins. But if um Trump is arrested, he can't run for office at all. And there are obviously a lot of people against Trump, and Trump has come out saying that it's politically motivated. I mean, I think hands down, Trump has been extremely corrupt in the way that he's dealt with some of these affairs. I mean, off the top of my head, he settled in court to talk about one of his partners had an abortion that he said in court. He got it in court that they couldn't talk about it. I can't remember who that was. I think that may have been Melania, but I may be wrong about that. I mean, there will be people that remember more off the top of my head, but obviously, paying off Stormy Daniels is in a long line of Trump just using money to keep everyone quiet and running on this moralistic high ground, despite being absolutely nowhere near that person in real life. But that's another problem in itself. But anyway, this is creating a really, really interesting situation, because the first thing it will show is it will show the hand of Trump's fan base. We'll see how determined Trump's fan base is, and obviously we have the absolute disaster that was the January 6th insurrection, and the sort of how we've seen that unfold in terms of the investigation and all of the action towards that. So that's the sort of first line of how Trump's fan base has been defending itself. But it will show, firstly, how badly can the so-called Teflon Don, will this stick, or will it just slide off? And if so, will it affect Trump and his election run? It'll be interesting to see, because it will show whether Trump has lost this support, and then if he wins the Republican primaries, if he becomes the Republican nominee, it'll be very interesting, because now that America have had 4 years of Joe Biden, there are things that Trump's very good at attacking people, and so now Biden can't run on the platform that I'm not Trump. So if Trump does win and he's running against Biden, that's going to be a very, very, very interesting, to say the least, position that both sides will be in. So very, very confusing situation. Obviously not too much has happened yet. Trump has just said he's being arrested. But it brings up all these questions. How will Trump's fan base react? Will we see Teflon Don return? And if we see Teflon Don return, will that actually boost him? Because if he doesn't get arrested, if the fan base gets loud and he doesn't get arrested, and they manage to sort of stall them out, then surely that will drive more support for Trump. So the timing of this actually can be weaponized by Trump. Trump is a master populist. He manages to manipulate situations incredibly in his favor, despite most of the time him being way out of the universe, I think, in some of the things that he's saying. But he has the gift of the gab. He has the skill to do this. So can this situation be turned around for Trump in his favor? That is an interesting question in itself, and all the speculation, I think, just leads down to one thing: is that American politics at the moment is so volatile. Neither party, obviously, with the great two-party state in America, that is incredibly sarcastic. Neither party seems to know what it's doing, really. I don't really think anyone stands for anything in America at the moment. They're just pretty much running on a lot of it is running on culture war. very simple dividing line. America seems to really not. I mean, as with a lot of countries, not really recovering from the pandemic and the sort of financial hit that they've taken. But with America, and I guess the same could be said for the UK. I think these two issues are pretty much the two countries. Sorry, are taking the same line on issues. Is that from what I see, there doesn't seem to be much meat in what the two, the Republicans and the Conservatives and Democrats and Labour in both countries are sort of arguing for, and everyone is trying to die on the culture war hill, probably because nobody wants to make big statements regarding how we're going to actually solve these sort of systematic social problems that are causing so much inequality and wealth issues in the country. So they're all dying on the culture war hill because neither side, let's be honest, especially with the UK, we're fighting over migrants and boats rather than the cost of living crisis. And in America, there is still, I mean, the issue of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, which was bad before the pandemic, has got worse. And again, you've got a supposed left leaning government that doesn't really seem to be doing much in favour of these people. So we seem to have reached a point in American and British politics where everyone in the political game is dying on the culture war hill, which is absolutely useless for the everyday person because, let's be honest, of all the hills to die on, it's not stupid, but it's a discourse. It's not a hill to die on. It's something that will never end. The culture war, if you really want to call it the culture war, is just culture. You're not fighting over culture because culture is constantly evolving. So it's just the worst thing to fight over at the moment when everyone is going through current circumstances. And again, I could speak more personally for the UK. Seeing how the price of things is just rising, also in the slow that going from week to week and suddenly things becoming more expensive, um, and 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 how that affects people, and the majority of what we're talking about in Parliament and in our sort of social, the political discourse is, oh well, we're going to now spend all this money creating deals to stop migrants on boats. Oh yeah, what do we do about the actual country and the state of the country? Yeah, we just don't talk about it. We just make it look like we're doing something, because that's all they can do. Nobody wants to make any big decisions. Then again, we have a right-leaning government in the UK, but there's a left-leaning government in America. So surely, if the left have any tangible solutions, well, I say left very loosely. Joe Biden is he's straight down the middle. Let's be honest. The Democrats moved to the right to pivot against Trump, and I think that's probably where the detriment of the country has come from. And I guess you could say the same for Labour against the current Conservatives, and maybe that's the issue with both the countries. This is a very tangent of Trump, but I think Trump is tantamount to the success of this because Trump forced the Democrats to pivot, and Trump has become such an influential figure in the rise in politics because Trump has got the Democrats to pivot. He's got the situation in America and probably undoubtedly affected the situation in the UK. Obviously, with Trump's election, people like Nigel Farage gained more momentum, and so that makes that made the Conservatives pivot further right, which then made Labour pivot further left. That didn't work, and so then they pivoted to the right again. So this is a domino effect. I'm not one for linchpins, but just sort of talking out an idea here. Trump has been massively influential on political movement of almost the past 10 years now. So it is something to. We all know how big of a figure he is. Will he survive this? Will he thrive from this? Who knows? We'll wait and see. And this will be certainly something that we'll be keeping an eye on in Duffington Talks. So anyway, coming to the end, I really, really thank you for listening. If you've got this far, give yourself a round of applause. I don't care where you are. Start clapping right now. I don't want to be too loud and just clap on the microphone, but I'm clapping to myself. Um, this was episode 2. Also, if anyone has any suggestions of what you want to hear me talk about, if you want to hear sort of a non-scheduled podcasty episode that's not released on a Monday that talks through a topic, also happy to do that. I'll obviously have to do some research of my own for that. But anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you guys for making it this far. I will see you next Monday. And like I said, if anyone has any topics, if anyone gives me any specific topics, this will be sort of like a Monday update. The Monday will be sort of recurring news. But if anyone has any separate topics, I will make separate podcast editions that come out at different times. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Thank you all for listening. Catch you in the next one.